Our next speaker is a composer who has been making electronic music since before Skrillex was born. He has made,
His compositions have been played all over the world, from Paris to Tokyo and Spaghetti in LA, and now can perform for us at Web. Please join me in welcoming also.
As Dolly mentioned, I'm a composer who's been working in the area of electronic music and using a computer for both creating, composing music as well as performing it since 1985. So what I'd like to talk about today is some of the work that I've been doing in the recent period. Developing a piece of music. It's an evening-long composition which is called Fujiken. And Fujiken is based on a series of field recordings as well as found or appropriated musical materials. All the field, I'm from Los Angeles originally, but I live in Tokyo. And I travel throughout Southeast Asia at least once a year. And just sort of like not a photographer, but a phonographer, I often travel, not so much with it, I do take a camera, but I also take a portable digital recorder with me that has microphones built in. And do a kind of sonic tourism, finding interesting sounds wherever I go. And in earlier this year, I started to build a piece out of a database, so it's a kind of library of sounds. Urban sounds, as well as natural sounds, as well as sounds from cassettes that I would find and buy on the street in Bangkok and Phnom Penh, or so on and so forth. So what I'd like to do is, explain a little bit about the aesthetic of the piece, but also talk about a couple of specific processes that I use. This is a couple of quotes that I introduced actually when Dolly saw me when I spoke at Hard Mud back in November. Quotes that I think are sort of important for my particular musical aesthetic. One is from René Char, each actor's version, even the repeating one, and Marcel Duchamp, to reach the impossibility of transferring from one like object to another the memory's imprint. What I take this to mean is that there is no such thing as true repetition. Even an event which repeats identically, that repetition is, our perception of it is conditioned by our experience of the previous iteration. And so even something that repeats over and over again, our appreciation of it evolves in a way because of that conditioning. As I mentioned, Fujiken is a live performance piece made of these field recordings. And Japan, where I live, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, the street cassettes that I found, all are sort of processed and blended seamlessly through various techniques that I've developed using programs that I build myself. I mentioned that the work is made up of a kind of library of sounds. Basically, I have a hard drive, which serves as a kind of database of recorded materials. And in performance, I will, based on intuition as much as anything else, plus some predetermined structuring, I will pull sounds out of the hard drive, mix them, combine them, and manipulate them. But what I started to be interested in doing was not just blending sounds from these recordings that I made, but actually sort of dissecting them, kind of like the way a surgeon would dissect it's almost calm. Where was I? Oh yes, I was dissecting sound. What I mean is that when you make a recording, a mono recording or a stereo recording, you basically have all the information combined into one or maybe two signals. And in the past, separating out these signals was very difficult. Certainly in an analog world, you could perform, equalization or filter sounds to a certain degree, remove the highs, for example, remove the lows, maybe take something out of the middle. But it was kind of a sledgehammer approach to splitting sounds apart. What I was interested in was more of a microscopic approach, where you could actually zero in on a particular sound and pull it out and separate it from everything else in the recorded environment. And this requires a kind of technique which is far, far different from just simple equalization. Using a thing which is called FFT, or Fast Fourier Transform Processing, we're able to do some of that. And I'll play an example a little bit. But I'd like to talk just a second or two about sort of the aesthetic of the piece itself. It is a kind of phonography, and it's part of a tradition which I call the cinema sonore, kind of phonorealism. Just as in art, you've probably seen examples of paintings where a painter will duplicate a photograph on maybe a larger scale. And from a distance, perhaps you could not even tell which is the photo and which is the painting. But of course, the mere act of transforming a painting, a photograph into a painting is an aesthetic statement, and also creates, obviously, a new object, even if they look basically identical. This is what John Cage talked about when he said that a recording of a Tchaikovsky symphony is electronic music. Okay? The embodiment of a piece of music by media makes it something else, even if it, on the surface, seems identical. So, cinema sonore is based on a kind of phonorealism. It uses natural sounds, not instrumental sounds. Usually the alterations are very, very subtle. You have to listen very attentively, and the time frame is typically very extended. Some of the antecedents of the cinema sonore come from the futurist movement, people who identified industrial noise as being a musical component. Of course, there was a movement called musique concrète, which started in France in the 1940s, where microphone recorded sounds of trains and automobiles and so on were captured, recorded onto 78 RPM records, actually, because they didn't even have really tape recordings. And then you would mix these recordings together, kind of proto-DJ work. And then this is John Cage up here. John Cage, of course, through his musical philosophy, said that there is no distinction between noise, what we call noise, and what we call music. That even the sound of an audience squirming in a seat, coughing, applauding, to be sure, those sounds are part of the music and part of the experience. And his famous piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, was 4 minutes and 33 seconds of a pianist doing nothing. And the act of doing nothing, and all the sounds, the extraneous sounds that we normally don't pay attention to, that was the music. Yeah. Luc Ferrari came out of the French school, but he's the one who really, he's kind of my grandfather in the cinema sonore, because he went out into a field and just made a recording, a real field recording in a pasture, or on the beach, and just recorded the sounds of everyday life, and did very, very subtle mixing, so that you really had to listen to find out what was going, in a sense, underneath the skin. Jean-Claude Awa made a piece called Gaku no Michi. It's 4 hours long, and it's all based on the sounds of Japan, but very, very transformed and also mixed in with electronic sounds. Kazuo Uehara, Makoto Shinohara, these are other people who have worked in the area of this kind of cinema sonore. So my approach in Fujikan is different from these, because these are all works for recorded media, the ones I mentioned before, for tape. I'm working in a live performance context, in a special environment, and the processing that I'm doing is actually being done in real time on the fly, using, these are technical terms, of spectral analysis and Fourier synthesis and resynthesis. So the biggest problem is how to do this dissection that I mentioned. When you have a recording, let's say, never mind a field recording, but let's say you have a mono recording of a cello concerto, and the cellist is too loud. How do you turn in a recording, a mono recording, the sound of the cello up or down relative to the orchestra behind him? It's very, very difficult to do. But these days, we have ways of isolating sounds, sound elements, through kind of intelligent processing and saying, that is the cello. Let's make it louder, let's make it softer. But what's more interesting for me is not working with instruments like that, but instead working with these sounds from nature and just say, making that bird louder, or something even more complicated. So in Bangkok 2 years ago, I dropped by this temple, the Sri Mahamariamman temple, which is a Hindu temple actually in Bangkok, and made some recording there. And as I listened to it, I became fascinated with one element. Oops. This is a recording, and you can hear kind of the hustle and the bustle, people talking, traffic going by, some announcements about bullhorn. If you listen carefully, way in the distance, there's actually being piped into a piece far away a recording of a Vedic chant. Can you hear it? So I sort of obsessed about that chant, and I wanted to pull it out, take everything else away, and just work with that as sonic material. Extending it, layering it, building it up, changing the balance, bringing in some of the other materials sometimes, taking it out again, and going into a kind of dream world with just this chant. So let's listen. First thing I do is I make it a little more present in the mix. And then start to take away everything else. And now that it's isolated, it's time to have some fun and start to thicken it, stretch it like taffy in both directions. maybe I would try to apply it to music, but not to just make the cello and the guitar louder, but actually working with vocal material as part of a pop recording. This is from a cassette that I bought in Bangkok. And here you can hear, I take out the singer's voice. It's a duet between a man and a woman. I focused in on the woman singer, and as she sings, I take everything out and start to multiply her voice. Technique adapted for use with musical. And do I have time for a shoot? No. It looks like my time's up, as a matter of fact. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.